Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology. Today we're going to be discussing the female reproductive system and the female reproductive cycle. So the female reproductive system consists of the gonads, which are the ovaries, the uterine tubes, also called fallopian tubes or oviducts, the uterus, the vagina, the external organs called the vulva or the pudendum, and the mammary glands. The ovaries are paired glands that are homologous to the testes, and they produce gametes that mature into ova, and they also produce hormones, including progesterone, estrogens, inhibin, and relaxin. Ovarian follicles consist of oocytes in various stages of development. The oocytes are the reproductive cells that contain the genetic material that are going to be passed on to the zygote. And they're surrounded by follicle cells that secrete estrogen as the follicle continues to grow. So together, these are called ovarian follicles, which are the oocyte in the middle with cells that surround it that help it to grow. A mature follicle is also called a Graafian follicle, and it's going to be large and fluid-filled. And the idea here is that it will eventually, during ovulation, expel the secondary oocyte that's contained inside. What's left over after it's expelled is the corpus luteum, and these are just the remnants of the mature follicle after ovulation. And the corpus luteum produces estrogen and progesterone until it degenerates into the corpus albicans. That term corpus luteum means yellow body, and that term corpus albicans means white body. And you can actually visually see these without the need of a microscope on ovaries. I've seen these in human ovaries when I did cadaver dissections. I've also seen them on monkey ovaries, and they're this yellow little round structure or a white structure, depending on the type. The process of oogenesis is the process whereby oocytes are made. So it starts with mitosis during fetal development that gives rise to primary oocytes. During fetal development, you also have the beginning of meiosis too, where secondary oocytes are made, but then those don't actually get ovulated, nor does meiosis get completed until later. Meiosis 2 actually occurs after ovulation and after fertilization. So you can see that this is going to look a little bit different than what we saw with spermatogenesis in males. So I want to remind you that a follicle is different from an oocyte. A follicle contains an oocyte in the center, and it has surrounding cells that support it. Each month after puberty, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH stimulate the development of primordial follicles. So a few start to grow every month, and they start to turn into primary follicles. However, only one is going to reach maturity. So this process is called follicular development because it's the growth of all the supporting cells in addition to the center oocyte. So in later stages of follicular development, the primary oocyte is surrounded by several layers of what are called granulosa cells. So you see here you have a primordial follicle, and then it turns into a late primary follicle. So as the follicle continues to grow, you're going to get what is called a secondary follicle. So what I mean by that is you have a theca folliculi that's consisting of the theca externa and the theca interna. And then if you move in more towards the center, you have the innermost layer of cells that surrounds the oocyte, and these are granulosa cells, and they become the corona radiata. The secondary follicle ends up turning into the final mature Graafian follicle. What you see with a Graafian follicle is that it has this really big antrum, which is filled with follicular fluid, and then it's surrounded by the corona radiata, which is made up of granulosa cells, and then it still has that outer layer of theca cells. So while in the mature follicle, there's a diploid primary oocyte that eventually completes meiosis 1, and it produces a haploid oocyte or secondary oocyte, which contains the majority of the cytoplasm. And then since it's completing meiosis 1, it actually divides its genetic material So the other half of the genetic material creates what's called a polar body. So once a cell becomes a mature or Graafian follicle, it's ready to be ovulated. And at ovulation, both the oocyte and the corona radiata, which is that surrounding layer of granulosa cells, enter the uterine tube. Now, at this stage, if sperm are present and fertilization can take place, that secondary oocyte that's contained there can continue into meiosis too. And what this will do is it will create the ovum and the second polar body. And then the ovum becomes a zygote when it unites with the sperm. Okay, so this figure here is designed to help you understand that oogenesis and follicular development go hand in hand. If you look off to the left, you see that during fetal development, oogonium are going to differentiate into primary oocytes. Now, that primary oocyte is going to be surrounded by some support cells, and so those are called primordial follicles. Now, they go through the beginnings of meiosis, but they're still called a primary oocyte. And then in early childhood, there really is no differentiation occurring. It's not until puberty hits that the primary follicle start to develop. So they go from being a primordial follicle to a primary follicle. And again, if you look here, you see that the oocyte that's in the center of the primary follicle is still considered a primary oocyte. But then those follicles after puberty start to differentiate and grow, and we see secondary follicles forming and then Graafian follicles. And then the primary oocytes start to differentiate into secondary oocytes as they continue going through meiosis. However, they do not complete meiosis II until after ovulation and fertilization. So that's what we end up seeing. And we also get what you see on the left, which are 3 polar bodies. And this is all occurring because of cell division. So the cell that keeps the big portion of the cytoplasm is the ovum. The rest of it, which includes just the genetic material, so just the DNA, gets dumped into these polar bodies during cell division. Going back to the right side of the graph, I want to make sure you understand. A primordial follicle grows into a primary follicle, a secondary follicle, a mature or Graafian follicle, and then that ovulates the secondary oocyte, which is basically going to be released into the uterus, and it's not until post-ovulation and post-fertilization that you see meiosis II being completed. So let's move on to a little bit of the anatomy of the female reproductive system. I know you covered some of this in lab. I just want to make sure you understand it all. Females have 2 uterine tubes that extend from the uterus to the ovaries, and these actually act as passageways for sperm to reach the ovum, because most of the time fertilization is actually going to occur in the uterine tubes. The end of the tube is called the infundibulum, and fimbriae, which are little finger-like projections, project from it. The ampulla is going to be what is the widest portion of the uterine tubes. Here you see an image of the uterus, and this should pretty much just be a reiteration of what you already learned in lab. If you look at uterine histology, which I know you already did in lab, you see that it has an outer layer that's serosa called the perimetrium, a middle layer which is made up of muscle, the myometrium, and the endometrium is the inner layer. And then that has 2 different layers, the stratum basalis and the stratum functionalis. The stratum functionalis is the layer that's shed every month during menstruation. The vagina is actually a canal that is lined with mucus, and this actually extends from the body's exterior to the cervix. And recall that the cervix is the opening to the uterus. So I want to make sure that you can differentiate between the vagina and the vulva. A lot of times when we talk about female reproductive anatomy, we call it a vagina, but we're actually talking about the vulva. The vulva is the external female reproductive anatomy, and it's also called the pudendum. And it's made up of the mons pubis, the labia minora, the labia majora, the clitoris, and the vestibule. So I want to point out that there's some homologous structures between male and female reproductive anatomy. The gonads are either ovaries in females or testes in males. The gametes are ovum in females and sperm cells in males. And since female reproductive structures and male reproductive structures actually develop from common precursor reproductive structures in the fetus, there's some other structures that are homologous as well. The labia majora are homologous to the scrotum, and the glans penis is homologous to the clitoris. And this is erectile tissue that is designed for creating or inducing pleasure. So it's really interesting that we have all of these different structures that come out to be very similar from one sex to another. The mammary glands are unique to females unless there's an estrogen problem in males. But basically, they're modified sodiferous glands that produce milk. And each mammary gland contains approximately 15 to 30 lobes. And each lobe has lobules. And within those lobules, there's milk-secreting glands that are called alveoli, different from the lung alveoli, but it's the same word. Each breast has a nipple that contains lactiferous ducts, and this is where the milk comes out of, and then the skin surrounding the nipple is called the areola. So that's the end of section 26.2. Now let's move on to the female reproductive cycle. The female reproductive cycle is quite complicated. I'm going to try to simplify it for you, but there's a lot to know. I want to point out that it encompasses both the ovarian and the uterine cycle, and all the hormones that regulate them and regulate the changes in the breast and the cervix. So the ovarian cycle is a series of events that occur in the ovaries that lead to the maturation of oocytes. And this is going to include follicular development and oogenesis. Whereas the uterine cycle, also called the menstrual cycle, is the series of changes in the uterine endometrium that prepare it for arrival of a fertilized ovum. So in order to understand this, we need to look at all the different hormones that are secreted and how they regulate the reproductive cycles. So first we need to point out that GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, is released from the hypothalamus, and this stimulates the anterior pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So FSH, what it does is it stimulates initial growth of ovarian follicles, but it also stimulates further development of ovarian follicles and the secretion of estrogen and inhibin. LH is going to continue to do that, but it's also going to help with the corpus luteum, where the corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone, estrogens, relaxin, and inhibin. So let's look at all the different hormones that are secreted from the follicles and the corpus luteum. We have estrogen that is secreted, and it promotes development and maintenance of female reproductive structures. We have inhibin that actually has a negative feedback and inhibits the release of FSH. We have relaxin, and that's actually going to lead to inhibition of contractions of smooth muscle. And then we have progesterone. And progesterone stimulates the endometrial glands to secrete glycogen and lipids, which are important in helping nourish the fertilized egg. High levels of this hormone are actually going to inhibit release of GnRH, FSH, and LH. So that's a lot of hormones. Let's take them one at a time and talk about what they do. GnRH, or gonadotropin-releasing hormone, is secreted by the hypothalamus. And what this does is it stimulates the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Next, we have FSH, and FSH actually initiates follicular growth, so it causes those follicles to start to grow, but it also stimulates those follicles to secrete estrogens. LH further stimulates the development of ovarian follicles. It stimulates them to secrete estrogens, and it is actually going to trigger ovulation. Estrogens are secreted by ovarian follicles, and they promote development and maintenance of female reproductive structures and secondary sex characteristics. So what do I mean by secondary sex characteristics? Those are things like breast development, hip curvature, that sort of thing. They are going to increase protein anabolism, including building strong bones, which is why females are more susceptible to osteoporosis after menopause, because estrogens are not secreted as much after menopause. They're going to inhibit via negative feedback mechanism the release of GnRH from the hypothalamus and LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary. And also, estrogens are going to help repair the endometrium after the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle. Progesterone is secreted by the corpus luteum, and it's going to work with estrogens to maintain the endometrium for implantation, but it's also going to cause mammary glands to promote milk production. It also inhibits secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and LH via a negative feedback mechanism. Two other hormones that we bring up, but we don't really reference too much, are relaxin and inhibin. Relaxin is produced by the corpus luteum, and it relaxes the uterus actually by inhibiting contraction of the myometrium. At the end of pregnancy, it actually increases the flexibility of the pubic symphysis and dilates the uterine cervix so that the baby can be born. And inhibin is secreted by some cells in the follicles and the corpus luteum, and this is actually going to inhibit secretion of FSH and LH as well. So the female reproductive cycle actually takes somewhere around 24 to 36 days, and it's divided into 4 phases: the menstrual phase, the pre-ovulatory phase, ovulation, and the post-ovulatory phase. So in this image, I want you to see that the days of the menstrual cycle are listed at the bottom, and that there's a series of events that occur in each phase. So the menstrual phase, day 1, marks the beginning of the menstrual cycle. And you'll see that it lasts for approximately 5 days. During that time, the primary follicles are starting to develop and the uterine lining is being sloughed off. Now, during the pre-ovulatory phase, the uterine lining is beginning to grow up again, and we're seeing that these primary follicles start to differentiate into mature or Graafian follicles. And they release a bunch of estrogen, which is what helps the uterine lining proliferate or get bigger. Then ovulation occurs, and I couldn't put a 9-hour circle around it, but I want you to know that it really is just in a very short period of time, 9 hours to 2 days. Ovulation occurs, which means that the oocyte is released into the uterus. And then the final phase is called the secretory phase or the post-ovulatory phase. And this is where the corpus luteum is the thing that's left behind after ovulation, and this causes the release of progesterone and estrogen, and this allows for maintenance of the uterine lining for a period of approximately 2 weeks, and then after that, menstruation begins, and the menstrual cycle starts all over again. When you look at this graph, you see what is going on with the hormones throughout that 28-day menstrual cycle. So at the beginning, most hormones levels are pretty low, but then when you start the pre-ovulatory phase, you see a rise in estrogens. And this is occurring because your primary follicles are starting to differentiate into secondary follicles and then the mature Graafian follicles. And those release estrogen. The high levels of estrogen during the last part of the pre-ovulatory phase are going to have a positive feedback effect on secreting LH and GnRH. And this is what causes the LH surge that leads to ovulation. Once ovulation occurs, you have the corpus luteum that's left over, and that secretes large amounts of progesterone and estrogen. So that's why those levels go back up on this graph again. Okay, let's go back and look at what happens during each phase of the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual phase is roughly the first 5 days of the cycle, meaning that the first day of menstruation is day 1 of a new menstrual cycle. So in the ovaries, you have several primordial follicles that begin to develop into primary follicles and then into secondary follicles. And this is caused by FSH. Now this process could actually take several months. So that means that the follicle that begins to develop in one cycle might actually not mature for several cycles later. In the uterus, menstrual discharge occurs when the declining levels of estrogen and progesterone that were secreted by the corpus luteum cause prostaglandins to be released, and this causes the uterine spiral arteries to constrict. This means then that cells that are deprived of oxygen begin to die, and the stratum functionalis sloughs off, and only the stratum basalis remains. The preovulatory phase is probably the most variable in that it goes anywhere from 6 to 13 days in a 28-day cycle, which would be what makes the menstrual cycle overall the most variable. So in the ovaries, some of the secondary follicles begin to secrete estrogens. And it turns out that there's one dominant follicle that starts to outgrow all the others, and this is what's going to become the mature or Graafian follicle. Estrogens in that dominant follicle cause a decrease in FSH, which stops all the other follicles from growing. What's interesting is that in fraternal or non-identical twins, actually more than one mature follicle is ovulated and fertilized at the same time. However, normally it's just one follicle that becomes dominant and is ovulated. In the ovarian cycle, the menstrual and pre-ovulatory phases together are termed the follicular phase. Okay, and then in the uterus, what we see is that estrogens stimulate the repair of the endometrium, and they cause the thickening of the endometrium by building up the stratum functionalis. And in the uterine cycle, the pre-ovulatory phase is termed the proliferative phase because what you see is that the endometrium is proliferating. Okay, so ovulation occurs when a mature follicle releases its secondary oocyte. It's going to basically rupture out of there. And this usually is going to occur about day 14 of the 28-day cycle. And what you see is that high levels of estrogens, because the Graafian follicle has gotten so large and is producing so much estrogen, it's going to cause a positive feedback effect on the cells of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary that secrete GnRH and LH. That's going to lead to an LH surge that causes the rupture of the mature follicle and expulsion of the secondary oocyte within that follicle about 9 hours after that peak of the LH. So the post-ovulatory phase is going to be the most constant of phases, meaning the period usually goes from day 15 to day 28. And this is happening in one ovary because the Graafian follicle that ruptured came from one ovary. And after ovulation, the mature follicle collapses to form what's called the corpus luteum under the influence of LH. The corpus luteum secretes high amounts of progesterone and estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. And in the ovarian cycle, we call this the luteal phase. Okay, that's a lot to know. And I want you to take a moment and maybe even pause here and look at all the different things that are occurring in the uterus, the ovaries, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the different feedback mechanisms. You'll see that in the uterus, while we have repair and proliferation of the endometrium, we also have growth of these follicles that are eventually going to mature into a dominant follicle, and that follicle is eventually going to ovulate and turn into the corpus luteum. But we also have all these negative and positive feedback effects that are happening between the hormones involved here. So take some time, maybe go back and not look at my scratches all over the place, and see if you can make connections between everything that's going on with the hormones, the uterus, and the ovaries. So we call this a cycle because this happens every 28 days over and over and over again. What's interesting is that if the oocyte is not fertilized, that corpus luteum lasts for about 2 weeks, and then the process starts over again. It's going to degenerate into what's called the corpus albicans, and then as the progesterone and estrogen levels start to decrease because the corpus luteum is no longer producing them, the release of GnRH, FSH, and LH start to rise again because there's now no longer a negative feedback. And then this means the cycle starts again. Follicular growth resumes and a new ovarian cycle begins. Same thing with the uterine cycle. However, if the uterus is fertilized, the corpus luteum is going to last for more than 2 weeks. And the reason for this is that if fertilization occurs, human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, which is produced by the chorion of the embryo at about 8 days after fertilization, stimulates the corpus luteum to stick around and then keep on producing progesterone and estrogen. This HCG is the hormone that we look for when we take a pregnancy test. So even if fertilization doesn't occur, progesterone and estrogen are continuing to be secreted by the corpus luteum for the first 2 weeks post-ovulation. This is called the secretory phase because of the secretory activity of the adrenal endometrial glands. And changes are going to start to peak around 1 week after ovulation because this is when the fertilized ovum might arrive from the fallopian tubes into the uterus. If fertilization does not occur, then the levels of progesterone and estrogen are going to decline because the corpus luteum is declining, and the decline of these levels are what's going to cause menstruation or the sloughing off of the uterine lining. Okay, so that was a lot of information, and I would highly recommend you use all the study guides that are available to you, as well as watching Crash Course Anatomy on the female reproductive system and the female reproductive cycle. It's a lot to know, it's pretty complicated, and there's a lot of things going on in the uterus and the ovaries and with hormones all at the same time. So please review that. The other things I want to remind you about are this week we have our virtual science symposium. So you'll have an assignment on Converge that's due by the end of this week. You need to go and watch those, and I'll post a link to them on Converge. And then Friday we're going to have our final Zoom meeting where we're going to review for our final exam. So I'll see you later, and happy studying.